Six men walk into a warehouse and take turns shooting a police officer. They don't just shoot him. They take their time, one limb at a time, laughing between rounds, and then they shoot him again until there is almost nothing left to shoot. The camera holds on it. You sit there and watch Alex Murphy, a good man, a family man, come apart piece by piece in one of the most brutal sequences in mainstream American cinema. Audiences in the summer of 1987 went in expecting something like The Terminator, and what they got instead put them back in their seats. That scene isn't there to shock you for its own sake. It's there to make you understand something before the story really begins, what it costs to become a product, and what gets stripped from a person when a corporation decides it owns them. The idea of a company buying a human being, rebuilding him into something more efficient, and sending him out to protect their property felt like science fiction in July 1987. It feels like something else now. This is RoboCop, one of the strangest, sharpest, and most consistently misread films of its decade. Walking into RoboCop in 1987, most audiences assumed they knew what they were getting. The posters told one story. The trailers practically made a promise. Orion Pictures even lifted the orchestral theme from The Terminator for the early commercials, just to make absolutely sure nobody showed up expecting art. What they found was something that baffled a large portion of those audiences, and quietly delighted a much smaller one. Paul Verhoeven came from the Netherlands, where he'd spent years making gritty, morally tangled films that Hollywood had been watching from a careful distance. His first encounter with the RoboCop script ended with him throwing it away, which is the kind of origin story the film somehow deserves. His wife retrieved it, read it herself, and told him he'd missed the whole point. It was a story about a man who loses himself completely and has to claw his way back to who he is. Verhoeven read it a second time and found what she was talking about, a Christ allegory wrapped inside a resurrection myth wrapped inside a satirical autopsy of the country he'd just moved to. His own description of the process was that he approached America anthropologically, the way a visitor studies a foreign culture he finds endlessly fascinating but doesn't entirely trust. Reagan's America gave him a lot of material. The privatization of public institutions, the media spectacle treating catastrophe as content, the corporate language of optimism plastered over genuine decay. All of it went directly into the film, undisguised and unapologetic. The fake commercials, the grinning news anchors reading disaster like a weather report, the board of executives logging a man's death as a line item, the catchphrase, "I'd buy that for $1, cycling through the film like a laugh track on a channel nobody chose to watch. Verhoeven wanted the satire turned up loud enough that audiences would laugh before they registered they should feel something else. For many people, that worked exactly as intended. For many others, they laughed and stayed right there, which was also in a way part of the point. Consider what the television does throughout the film. Every cut to a media break segment shows anchors beaming, genuinely and vacuously delighted to be there, announcing that South Africa has deployed a new neutron bomb with the same energy they'd bring to a feel-good story about a neighborhood garden. The world burns. The broadcast stays sunny. In 1987, the 24-hour news cycle was still new enough to feel like a novelty rather than the water we all swim in now, and Verhoeven was already drawing it to its endpoint, a media apparatus that performs empathy while feeling none, delivering catastrophe with the pacing and effect of light entertainment. Media Break isn't a parody of what existed in 1987. It's a blueprint for what was on its way. The commercials cut even closer. A board game called Nukem invites families to cheerfully launch nuclear missiles at one another. A luxury car advertisement delivers its pitch with a tagline so relentlessly upbeat it reads as a mild threat. None of these are much of a stretch from the actual advertising culture of the Reagan era, which operated in its own kind of willful fantasy about national identity and national destiny. Right up to the last day of filming, Verhoeven kept inserting new satirical elements, responding in real time to the country around him. He had no investment in America's self-image, no stake in protecting its myths, and that distance gave the film a clarity that most of its American audience couldn't quite locate because they were standing too close. All of it is in the film, every bit of it. Strip away the armor and the action sequences, and what RoboCop is actually staging is a labor dispute. Detroit's police force has gone on strike. The city itself, effectively purchased and operated by Omni Consumer Products, has reached the conclusion that human officers are expensive, unreliable, union-affiliated liabilities. What OCP wants is a product, something that performs without complaint, can't be organized, can't be bribed, and doesn't come in one morning unable to function. Alex Murphy's death, seen from this angle, follows a cold logic. OCP transfers him to the worst precinct in the city, the one that functions as a killing floor for officers they've written off. He walks into that warehouse because someone further up the corporate chain needed a suitable candidate, and his death becomes, in the film's terms, a business decision in search of a volunteer. What follows is that he becomes a product, branded, directive-loaded, equipped with a face that is technically his face, deployed to sell the public on the idea of safety, while OCP quietly plans to demolish the city he's protecting and rebuild it as Delta City. Murphy isn't saved. He's repurposed. And there's a difference. The piece of this that lands differently today isn't the corporate villainy itself, which movies have given us in one form or another for as long as movies have existed. It's the language, the way OCP discusses Murphy's body as an asset, the way his identity becomes an intellectual property question. That vocabulary, the framing of a human being as something to be optimized and deployed and owned, has become so ordinary in the decades since 1987 that it barely produces a reaction. The bodies and attention and data of ordinary people flow through systems designed to extract value from them. And the strangest thing about objecting to this is how strange objecting to it sounds. RoboCop named this in 1987, in Blood and Satire, almost 40 years before it became the texture of daily life. There's a scene early in the film where a senior OCP executive demonstrates the ED-209, the company's other prototype for automated law enforcement. The demonstration goes wrong in the worst way possible, leaving a man dead in front of the entire leadership team. The old man, OCP's CEO, looks at the body and says someone will have to answer for this. And then the meeting continues. The project continues. Everything continues. That moment carries a weight now that it might not have in 1987. Not because corporate indifference to human cost is new, but because the specific grammar of it, the performance of accountability, the swift reassignment of blame, the frictionless return to business, has become so familiar. The body on the floor is a management problem rather than a person, and the calendar doesn't pause. Kurtwood Smith plays Dick Jones, the film's primary corporate antagonist, and the choice to make him completely undramatic turns out to be the film's sharpest decision. He doesn't monologue, he doesn't posture. He makes deals, shields his interests, and removes obstacles with the flat efficiency of someone who genuinely can't distinguish between what he's able to do and what he has any right to do. The evil in Dick Jones isn't theatrical, it's systemic. A man whose behavior makes perfect sense inside the system that produced him. RoboCop earns its place not because it predicted specific events, but because it identified the underlying logic clearly enough that the events it was describing were always going to arrive. The scene that convinced Verhoeven to direct the film isn't an action sequence. Murphy, now RoboCop, now running on directives and tactical overlays with no acknowledged memory of his previous life, drives to a house in the suburbs. Nothing in his programming explains why. He stands outside looking at it, and slowly, in pieces that arrive without warning, he begins to remember: a child working through a coin trick, a woman's laugh from another room, morning light coming through a hallway he recognizes without being able to name. None of those memories are large. They're the kind of small, specific, ordinary details that nobody archives because nobody thinks they need to, the kind that live only inside the person who accumulated them. Watching Murphy reach toward that warmth, through layers of metal and programming, is the closest the film gets to quiet, and it earns it. Peter Weller does something genuinely difficult in this role. Every conventional tool of screen performance, facial expression, natural gesture, physical ease, gets taken away from him for most of the film, and he makes you feel what Murphy is going through anyway. A shift in posture, the angle of a shoulder, a pause held a beat longer than mechanics would require. Before filming started, Weller spent weeks studying mime technique, and that investment is audible in every scene where RoboCop isn't shooting anyone. Worth noticing is how Verhoeven shoots the memory sequences differently from everything else in the film. The present-day footage runs hard and sharp, industrial light, fast cuts, the visual texture of a place that has given up on being comfortable. The memories arrive warm and slightly out of focus, filmed with the quality of something that exists in the gap between sleep and waking. They look like a different film entirely, which is precisely what Verhoeven wanted. The contrast does the work that dialogue would only weaken. A corporation can own hardware. It can write directives. What it can't reach is whatever Murphy carries in the spaces between those directives. The material that was never entered into any database because nobody knew it existed. The quiet of the scene where Murphy stands outside his own house, unable to cross the threshold, works because of everything that surrounds it. 45 minutes of Verhoeven detonating everything in the frame, and then a man standing on a pavement, trying to remember what it felt like to belong somewhere. That scene is what the film is actually about. Not the satire, sharp as it is. Not the action, impressive as it remains. The film is about the parts of a person that survive when a system takes everything else. About the fact that identity doesn't live in a body or a contract or a directive set, that something remains regardless, and that reclaiming it is what the story is ultimately for. Murphy comes back, not because OCP's programming allows for it, and not because a directive points him that way. He comes back because the things that made him Alex Murphy, his sense of what's just, his commitment to the people around him, his love for a family he can barely picture, those things were never in the software to begin with, and no rewrite can touch them. Old Detroit is easy to read as backdrop. a stylized near-future city that exists to justify the satire and provide somewhere for things to explode. Verhoeven had something more specific in mind. The city in RoboCop has failed the people living in it. Systematically and over time, crime operates without meaningful consequence. The police force, underfunded and demoralized, has walked off the job. The buildings decay while OCP's solution runs in parallel. Not repair, but replacement. Demolish old Detroit. Build Delta City. A gleaming corporate environment where the right kind of people can live safely and consume reliably. The people currently living in old Detroit don't factor into that plan as residents. They appear in it as the obstacle to be cleared before development can begin. Bodeker's gang functions as OCP's deniable ground-level operation, accelerating the conditions that make displacement feel inevitable, and they are the visible surface of a much larger financial interest. The film understood in 1987 that urban destruction doesn't usually announce itself. It doesn't arrive as a villain in a boardroom explaining his intentions. Though the film gives us that scene too and plays it for appropriate comedy, it arrives through the slow withdrawal of investment, through conditions made dangerous enough that leaving becomes the only rational choice, through the steady reclassification of communities from assets into liabilities. OCP's pitch for Delta City includes 2 million jobs, safety, prosperity, and the future itself, delivered without irony by executives who appear to genuinely believe what they're saying. That's the detail that makes it frightening rather than cartoonish, the absence of self-awareness. These aren't people concealing their intentions. They've convinced themselves that what they want and what's good for everyone are the same thing, and that conviction makes them far more dangerous than straightforward greed would. Detroit in 1987 wasn't a fictional city. Though industrialization had been hollowing it out for years, the automotive industry contracting steadily, unemployment and crime rising in step with each other, the question of what the city was supposed to become a live and contested one. Verhoeven shot the film in Dallas rather than Detroit, but the film always knew which city it was describing. Beneath the satire in these sequences, there's a quieter register. Lewis, Murphy's partner, is the film's most grounded character, competent and loyal and completely uninterested in being told what she can manage. She represents the police force as it should function, something that belongs to and answers to the community it serves. The corruption that arrives from above hits her differently than it hits anyone else in the film, because she actually believed in what the institution was supposed to be. Nancy Allen brings a straight-backed seriousness to the role that the film earns over time, and the partnership between Lewis and Murphy keeps the whole thing anchored in something human when everything else is pulling toward spectacle. The film tells you exactly what it thinks. It does this loudly, at full volume, with complete clarity, and it manages to stay entertaining throughout. That combination of directness and watchability is arguably the most sophisticated thing RoboCop pulls off. The final line of RoboCop is a single word. Dick Jones has just been removed from the situation. The old man, OCP's CEO and the one person in the building who retains some residual sense of decency, turns to face the machine standing in his office and asks it a simple question. "What is your name?" Peter Weller answers very quietly and very simply. "Murphy." Not RoboCop. Not the designation on the asset report. Not Directive 4. Murphy. That moment carries the weight of everything that came before it. The execution in the warehouse, the fragmented memories of his family, the life he wasn't supposed to be able to remember, the choice to remove his visor so his face could be seen by the people around him, which no directive required and nothing in the programming suggested. A person's face should be visible. Murphy knew that even when the software didn't, he survives. Not as a brand, not as a product launch, not as a symbol of corporate investment. As a man who held onto his name through everything that tried to take it. The film doesn't feel like a document from 40 years ago, even though it's saturated with the aesthetics and anxieties of the Reagan era, because the question at its center hasn't aged. What remains of a person after a system has taken everything it wanted from them? That question was live in 1987. It's live now. It will stay live for as long as systems exist that find it profitable to treat people as raw material. RoboCop is a film about reclaiming your name, and everything in it is organized around that one quiet, certain syllable at the end. If it's been a while since you watched RoboCop, tonight is the right time. Not primarily for the action, though the action holds up in ways most films from that era simply don't. Verhoeven built the whole thing on practical effects, real locations and stunt work that gave every impact a physical weight that no amount of rendering can replicate. The ED-209's stop-motion movement reads as mechanical today, and Verhoeven knew it would read as mechanical even then, which is why he shot those sequences fast and loud, carrying the audience past the seams before they could settle there. The filmmaking throughout the film is shrewd enough to make you forget the places where the budget ran out. The real reason to go back is the stubborn optimism buried underneath the violence and the satire. On its surface, RoboCop is cynical in ways that make most cynical films look polite. The world it describes has had its institutions hollowed out, its public language colonized by corporate interest, its capacity to protect ordinary people sold off to the lowest bidder. A man gets killed, rebuilt into a product, and sent back out. And nobody in any position of authority stops to ask whether any of this is acceptable. And yet Murphy comes back, not as a brand extension, not as a press release, as a person who has a name and who, across the whole length of this film, refuses to let go of it. In a film this clear-eyed about how systems work, how they absorb people and convert them into function, that decision to end on a single human word, spoken quietly and with complete conviction, is the whole argument. No matter how thoroughly a system believes it owns someone, something remains outside its reach, something that waits, and something that knows its own name. Go and watch RoboCop tonight, and when the final scene arrives, when Murphy answers that question, sit with it for a moment and think about what it would take for that answer to cost something. The comments are open.